The Mysterious Island, Jules Verne. Part 2. Chapter 6. The inventory of the articles possessed by these castaways from the clouds, thrown upon a coast which appeared to be uninhabited, was soon made out. They had nothing save the clothes which they were wearing at the time of the catastrophe. We must mention, however, a notebook and a watch which Gideon Spilett had kept, doubtless by inadvertence, not a weapon, not a tool, not even a pocket-knife, for while in the car they had thrown out everything to lighten the balloon. The imaginary heroes of Daniel Defoe or of Weiss, as well as Selkirk and Reynolds shipwrecked on Juan Fernandez and on the archipelago of the Aucklands, were never in such absolute destitution. Either they had abundant resources from their stranded vessels, in grain, cattle, tools, ammunition, or else some things were thrown up on the coast which supplied them with all the first necessities of life. But here, not any instrument whatever, not a utensil. From nothing they must supply themselves with everything. And yet, if Cyrus Harding had been with them, if the engineer could have brought his practical science, his inventive mind to bear on their situation, perhaps all hope would not have been lost. Alas, they must hope no longer again to see Cyrus Harding. The castaways could expect nothing but from themselves and from that Providence which never abandons those whose faith is sincere. But ought they to establish themselves on this part of the coast, without trying to know to what continent it belonged, if it was inhabited, or if they were on the shore of a desert island? It was an important question, and should be solved with the shortest possible delay. From its answer they would know what measures to take. However, according to Pencroft's advice, it appeared best to wait a few days before commencing an exploration. They must, in fact, prepare some provisions and procure more strengthening food than eggs and mollusks. The explorers, before undertaking new fatigues, must first of all recruit their strength. The chimneys offered a retreat sufficient for the present. The fire was lighted, and it was easy to preserve some embers. There were plenty of shellfish and eggs among the rocks and on the beach. It would be easy to kill a few of the pigeons which were flying by hundreds about the summit of the plateau, either with sticks or stones. Perhaps the trees of the neighboring forest would supply them with eatable fruit. Lastly, the sweet water was there. It was accordingly settled that for a few days they would remain at the chimneys so as to prepare themselves for an expedition, either along the shore or into the interior of the country. This plan suited Neb particularly. As obstinate in his ideas as in his presentiments, he was in no haste to abandon this part of the coast, the scene of the catastrophe. He would not believe in the loss of Cyrus Harding. No, it did not seem to him possible that such a man had ended in this vulgar fashion, carried away by a wave, drowned in the floods, a few hundred feet from a shore. As long as the waves had not cast up the body of the engineer, as long as he, Neb, had not seen with his eyes, touched with his hands the corpse of his master, he would not believe in his death. And this idea rooted itself deeper than ever in his determined heart. An illusion, perhaps, but still an illusion to be respected, and one which the sailor did not wish to destroy. As for him, he hoped no longer, but there was no use in arguing with Neb. He was like the dog who will not leave the place where his master is buried, and his grief was such that most probably he would not survive him. This same morning, the 26th of March, at daybreak, Neb had set out on the shore in a northerly direction, and he had returned to the spot where the sea, no doubt, had closed over the unfortunate Harding. That day's breakfast was composed solely of pigeons' eggs and lithodomes. Herbert had found some salt deposited by evaporation in the hollows of the rocks, and this mineral was very welcome. The repast ended, Pencroft asked the reporter if he wished to accompany Herbert and himself to the forest, where they were going to try to hunt, but on consideration it was thought necessary that someone should remain to keep in the fire, and to be at hand in the highly improbable event of Neb requiring aid. The reporter accordingly remained behind. "To the chase, Herbert," said the sailor. "We shall find ammunition on our way and cut our weapons in the forest." But at the moment of starting, Herbert observed that since they had no tinder, it would perhaps be prudent to replace it by another substance. "What?" asked Pencroft. "Burnt linen," replied the boy. "That could, in case of need, serve for tinder." The sailor thought it very sensible advice, only it had the inconvenience of necessitating the sacrifice of a piece of handkerchief. Notwithstanding, the thing was well worth while trying, and a part of Pencroft's large checked handkerchief was soon reduced to the state of a half-burnt rag. This inflammable material was placed in the central chamber at the bottom of a little cavity in the rock, sheltered from all wind and damp. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. The weather was threatening, and the breeze blew from the southeast. Herbert and Pencroft turned the angle of the chimneys, not without having cast a look at the smoke which, just at that place, curled round a point of rock. They ascended the left bank of the river. Arrived at the forest, Pencroft broke from the first tree 2 stout branches which he transformed into clubs, the ends of which Herbert rubbed smooth on a rock. Oh, what would they not have given for a knife? The 2 hunters now advanced among the long grass, following the bank. From the turning which directed its course to the southwest, the river narrowed gradually, and the channel lay between high banks, over which the trees formed a double arch. Pencroft, lest they should lose themselves, resolved to follow the course of the stream, which would always lead them back to the point from which they started. But the bank was not without some obstacles. Here the flexible branches of the trees bent level with the current, there creepers and thorns which they had to break down with their sticks. Herbert often glided among the broken stumps with the agility of a young cat and disappeared in the underwood. But Pencroft called him back directly, begging him not to wander away. Meanwhile, the sailor attentively observed the disposition and nature of the surrounding country. On the left bank, the ground, which was flat and marshy, rose imperceptibly towards the interior. It looked there like a network of liquid threads, which doubtless reached the river by some underground drain. Sometimes a stream ran through the underwood, which they crossed without difficulty. The opposite shore appeared to be more uneven, and the valley of which the river occupied the bottom was more clearly visible. The hill, covered with trees disposed in terraces, intercepted the view. On the right bank, walking would have been difficult, for the declivities fell suddenly, and the trees bending over the water were only sustained by the strength of their roots. It is needless to add that this forest, as well as the coast already surveyed, was destitute of any sign of human life. Pencroft only saw traces of quadrupeds, fresh footprints of animals, of which he could not recognize the species. In all probability, and such was also Herbert's opinion, some had been left by formidable wild beasts, which doubtless would give them some trouble, but nowhere did they observe the mark of an axe on the trees, nor the ashes of a fire, nor the impression of a human foot. On this they might probably congratulate themselves, for on any land in the middle of the Pacific the presence of man was perhaps more to be feared than desired. Herbert and Pencroft, speaking little, for the difficulties of the way were great, advanced very slowly, and after walking for an hour they had scarcely gone more than a mile. As yet the hunt had not been successful. However, some birds sang and fluttered in the foliage, and appeared very timid, as if man had inspired them with an instinctive fear. Among others, Herbert described, in a marshy part of the forest, a bird with a long pointed beak, closely resembling the kingfisher, but its plumage was not fine, though of a metallic brilliancy. "That must be a jacamar," said Herbert, trying to get nearer. "This will be a good opportunity to taste jacamar," replied the sailor, "if that fellow is in a humor to be roasted." Just then, a stone cleverly thrown by the boy struck the creature on the wing, but the blow did not disable it, and the jacamar ran off and disappeared in an instant. "How clumsy I am!" cried Herbert. "No, no, my boy," replied the sailor. "The blow was well aimed, many a one would have missed it altogether. Come, don't be vexed with yourself. We shall catch it another day." As the hunters advanced, the trees were found to be more scattered, many being magnificent, but none bore eatable fruit. Pencroft searched in vain for some of those precious palm trees which are employed in so many ways in domestic life, and which have been found as far as the 40th parallel in the northern hemisphere, and to the 35th only in the southern hemisphere. But this forest was only composed of coniferae, such as deodaras, already recognized by Herbert, and Douglas pine, similar to those which grow on the northwest coast of America, and splendid firs, measuring 150 feet in height. At this moment, a flock of birds, of a small size and pretty plumage, with long glancing tails, dispersed themselves among the branches, strewing their feathers, which covered the ground as with fine down. Herbert picked up a few of these feathers, and after having examined them, "These are carucas," said he. "I should prefer a moorcock or guinea fowl," replied Pencroft. "Still, if they are good to eat—" "They are good to eat, and also their flesh is very delicate," replied Herbert. "Besides, if I don't mistake, it is easy to approach and kill them with a stick." The sailor and the lad, creeping among the grass, arrived at the foot of a tree, whose lower branches were covered with little birds. The carucas were waiting the passage of insects which served for their nourishment. Their feathery feet could be seen clasping the slender twigs which supported them. The hunters then rose, and using their sticks like scythes, they mowed down whole rows of these carucas, who never thought of flying away and stupidly allowed themselves to be knocked off. 100 were already heaped on the ground before the others made up their minds to fly. "Well," said Pencroft, "here is game, which is quite within the reach of hunters like us. We have only to put out our hands and take it." The sailor having strung the carucas like larks on flexible twigs, they then continued their exploration. The stream here made a bend towards the south, but this detour was probably not prolonged, for the river must have its source in the mountain, and be supplied by the melting of the snow which covered the sides of the central cone. The particular object of their expedition was, as has been said, to procure the greatest possible quantity of game for the inhabitants of the Chimneys. It must be acknowledged that as yet this object had not been attained. So the sailor actively pursued his researches, though he exclaimed when some animal which he had not even time to recognize fled into the long grass, "If only we had had the dog Top!" But Top had disappeared at the same time as his master, and had probably perished with him. Towards 3 o'clock, new flocks of birds were seen through certain trees, at whose aromatic berries they were pecking, those of the juniper tree among others. Suddenly, a loud trumpet call resounded through the forest. This strange and sonorous cry was produced by a game bird called grouse in the United States. They soon saw several couples whose plumage was rich chestnut brown, mottled with dark brown, and tail of the same color. Herbert recognized the males by the two wing-like appendages raised on the neck. Pencroft determined to get hold of at least one of these gallinaceae, which were as large as a fowl, and whose flesh is better than that of a pullet. But it was difficult, for they would not allow themselves to be approached. After several fruitless attempts, which resulted in nothing but scaring the grouse, the sailor said to the lad, "Decidedly, since we can't kill them on the wing, we must try to take them with a line." "Like a fish?" cried Herbert, much surprised at the proposal. "Like a fish," replied the sailor quite seriously. Pencroft had found among the grass 6 grouse nests, each having 3 or 4 eggs. He took great care not to touch these nests, to which their proprietors would not fail to return. It was around these that he meant to stretch his lines, not snares, but real fishing lines. He took Herbert to some distance from the nests, and there prepared his singular apparatus with all the care which a disciple of Isaac Walton would have used. Herbert watched the work with great interest, though rather doubting its success. The lines were made of fine creepers, fastened one to the other, of the length of 15 or 20 feet. Thick, strong thorns, the points bent back, which were supplied from a dwarf acacia bush, were fastened to the ends of the creepers by way of hooks. Large red worms, which were crawling on the ground, furnished bait. This done, Pencroft, passing among the grass and concealing himself skilfully, placed the end of his lines armed with hooks near the grouse nests. Then he returned, took the other ends, and hid with Herbert behind a large tree. There they both waited patiently, though it must be said that Herbert did not reckon much on the success of the inventive Pencroft. A whole half-hour passed, but then, as the sailor had surmised, several couple of grouse returned to their nests. They walked along, pecking the ground, and not suspecting in any way the presence of the hunters, who, besides, had taken care to place themselves to leeward of the gallinaceae. The lad felt at this moment highly interested. He held his breath, and Pencroft, his eyes staring, his mouth open, his lips advanced, as if about to taste a piece of grouse, scarcely breathed. Meanwhile, the birds walked about the hooks without taking any notice of them. Pencroft then gave little tugs which moved the bait as if the worms had been still alive. The sailor undoubtedly felt much greater anxiety than does the fisherman, for he does not see his prey coming through the water. The jerks attracted the attention of the gallinaceae, and they attacked the hooks with their beaks. 3 voracious grouse swallowed at the same moment bait and hook. Suddenly, with a smart jerk, Pencroft struck his line, and a flapping of wings showed that the birds were taken. "Hurrah!" he cried, rushing towards the game, of which he made himself master in an instant. Herbert clapped his hands. It was the first time that he had ever seen birds taken with a line, but the sailor modestly confessed that it was not his first attempt, and that besides he could not claim the merit of invention. "And at any rate," added he, "situated as we are, we must hope to hit upon many other contrivances." The grouse were fastened by their claws, and Pencroft, delighted at not having to appear before their companions with empty hands, and observing that the day had begun to decline, judged it best to return to their dwelling. The direction was indicated by the river, whose course they had only to follow, and, towards 6 o'clock, tired enough with their excursion, Herbert and Pencroft arrived at the Chimneys. Chapter 7. Gideon Spilett was standing motionless on the shore, his arms crossed, gazing over the sea, the horizon of which was lost towards the east in a thick black cloud which was spreading rapidly towards the zenith. The wind was already strong and increased with the decline of day. The whole sky was of a threatening aspect, and the first symptoms of a violent storm were clearly visible. Herbert entered the Chimneys, and Pencroft went towards the reporter. The latter, deeply absorbed, did not see him approach. "We are going to have a dirty night, Mr. Spilett," said the sailor. "Petrels delight in wind and rain." The reporter, turning at the moment, saw Pencroft, and his first words were, "At what distance from the coast would you say the car was, when the waves carried off our companion?" The sailor had not expected this question. He reflected an instant and replied, 2 cables' lengths at the most." "But what is a cable's length?" asked Gideon Spilett. "About 120 fathoms, or 600 feet. "Then," said the reporter, "Cyrus Harding must have disappeared 1,200 feet at the most from the shore." "About that," replied Pencroft. "And his dog also?" "Also." "What astonishes me," rejoined the reporter, "while admitting that our companion has perished, is that Top has also met his death, and that neither the body of the dog nor of his master has been cast on the shore." "It is not astonishing with such a heavy sea," replied the sailor. "Besides, it is possible that currents have carried them farther down the coast." "Then it is your opinion that our friend has perished in the waves?" again asked the reporter. "That is my opinion." "My own opinion," said Gideon Spilett, "with due deference to your experience, Pencroft, is that in the double fact of the absolute disappearance of Cyrus and Top, living or dead, there is something unaccountable and unlikely." "I wish I could think like you, Mr. Spilett," replied Pencroft. "Unhappily, my mind is made up on this point." Having said this, the sailor returned to the Chimneys. A good fire crackled on the hearth. Herbert had just thrown on an armful of dry wood, and the flame cast a bright light into the darkest parts of the passage. Pencroft immediately began to prepare the dinner. It appeared best to introduce something solid into the bill of fare, for all needed to get up their strength. The strings of Carucas were kept for the next day, but they plucked a couple of grouse, which were soon spitted on a stick and roasting before a blazing fire. At 7 in the evening, Neb had not returned. The prolonged absence of the negro made Pencroft very uneasy. It was to be feared that he had met with an accident on this unknown land, or that the unhappy fellow had been driven to some act of despair. But Herbert drew very different conclusions from this absence. According to him, Neb's delay was caused by some new circumstances which had induced him to prolong his search. Also, everything new must be to the advantage of Cyrus Harding. Why had Neb not returned unless hope still detained him? Perhaps he had found some mark, a footstep, a trace which had put him in the right path. Perhaps he was at this moment on a certain track. Perhaps even he was near his master. Thus the lad reasoned. Thus he spoke. His companions let him talk. The reporter alone approved with a gesture. But what Pencroft thought most probable was that Neb had pushed his researches on the shore farther than the day before, and that he had not as yet had time to return. Herbert, however, agitated by vague presentiments, several times manifested an intention to go to meet Neb. But Pencroft assured him that that would be a useless course, that in the darkness and deplorable weather he could not find any traces of Neb, and that it would be much better to wait. If Neb had not made his appearance by the next day, Pencroft would not hesitate to join him in his search. Gideon Spilett approved of the sailor's opinion that it was best not to divide, and Herbert was obliged to give up his project, but two large tears fell from his eyes. The reporter could not refrain from embracing the generous boy. Bad weather now set in. A furious gale from the southeast passed over the coast. The sea roared as it beat over the reef. Heavy rain was dashed by the storm into particles like dust. Ragged masses of vapor drove along the beach, on which the tormented shingles sounded as if poured out in cartloads, while the sand raised by the wind added, as it were, mineral dust to that which was liquid, and rendered the united attack insupportable. Between the river's mouth and the end of the cliff, eddies of wind whirled, and gusts from this maelstrom lashed the water which ran through the narrow valley. The smoke from the fireplace was also driven back through the opening, filling the passages and rendering them uninhabitable. Therefore, as the grouse were cooked, Pencroft let the fire die away, and only preserved a few embers buried under the ashes. At 8 o'clock Neb had not appeared, but there was no doubt that the frightful weather alone hindered his return, and that he must have taken refuge in some cave to await the end of the storm, or at least the return of day. As to going to meet him or attempting to find him, it was impossible. The game constituted the only dish at supper. The meat was excellent, and Pencroft and Herbert, whose long excursion had rendered them very hungry, devoured it with infinite satisfaction. Their meal concluded, each retired to the corner in which he had rested the preceding night, and Herbert was not long in going to sleep near the sailor, who had stretched himself beside the fireplace. Outside, as the night advanced, the tempest also increased in strength until it was equal to that which had carried the prisoners from Richmond to this land in the Pacific. The tempests which are frequent during the seasons of the equinox, and which are so prolific in catastrophes, are above all terrible over this immense ocean which opposes no obstacle to their fury. No description can give an idea of the terrific violence of the gale as it beat upon the unprotected coast. Happily, the pile of rocks which formed the chimneys was solid. It was composed of enormous blocks of granite, a few of which, insecurely balanced, seemed to tremble on their foundations, and Pencroft could feel rapid quiverings under his head as it rested on the rock. But he repeated to himself, and rightly, that there was nothing to fear, and that their retreat would not give way. However, he heard the noise of stones torn from the summit of the plateau by the wind, falling down onto the beach. A few even rolled on to the upper part of the chimneys, or flew off in fragments when they were projected perpendicularly. Twice the sailor rose and entrenched himself at the opening of the passage, so as to take a look in safety at the outside. But there was nothing to be feared from these showers, which were not considerable, and he returned to his couch before the fireplace, where the embers glowed beneath the ashes. Notwithstanding the fury of the hurricane, the uproar of the tempest, the thunder, and the tumult, Herbert slept profoundly. Sleep at last took possession of Pencroft, whom a seafaring life had habituated to anything. Gideon Spilett alone was kept awake by anxiety. He reproached himself with not having accompanied Neb. It was evident that he had not abandoned all hope. The presentiments which had troubled Herbert did not cease to agitate him also. His thoughts were concentrated on Neb. Why had Neb not returned? He tossed about on his sandy couch, scarcely giving a thought to the struggle of the elements. Now and then his eyes, heavy with fatigue, closed for an instant, but some sudden thought reopened them almost immediately. Meanwhile, the night advanced, and it was perhaps 2 hours from morning when Pencroft, then sound asleep, was vigorously shaken. "What's the matter?" he cried, rousing himself and collecting his ideas with the promptitude usual to seamen. The reporter was leaning over him and saying, "Listen, Pencroft, listen." The sailor strained his ears, but could hear no noise beyond those caused by the storm. "It is the wind," said he. "No," replied Gideon Spilett, listening again. "I thought I heard—" "What?" "The barking of a dog." "A dog!" cried Pencroft, springing up. "Yes, barking. It's not possible," replied the sailor. "And besides, how, in the roaring of the storm—" "Stop, listen," said the reporter. Pencroft listened more attentively, and really thought he heard, during a lull, distant barking. "Well," said the reporter, pressing the sailor's hand. "Yes, yes," replied Pencroft. "It is Top! It is Top!" cried Herbert, who had just awoke, and all three rushed towards the opening of the chimneys. They had great difficulty in getting out. The wind drove them back, but at last they succeeded, and could only remain standing by leaning against the rocks. They looked about, but could not speak. The darkness was intense. The sea, the sky, the land were all mingled in one black mass. Not a speck of light was visible. The reporter and his companions remained thus for a few minutes, overwhelmed by the wind, drenched by the rain, blinded by the sand. Then, in a pause of the tumult, they again heard the barking, which they found must be at some distance. It could only be Top. But was he alone or accompanied? He was most probably alone, for if Neb had been with him, he would have made his way more directly towards the chimneys. The sailor squeezed the reporter's hand, for he could not make himself heard, in a way which signified, "Wait." Then he re-entered the passage. An instant after, he issued with a lighted faggot, which he threw into the darkness, whistling shrilly. It appeared as if this signal had been waited for. The barking immediately came nearer, and soon a dog bounded into the passage. Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett entered after him. An armful of dry wood was thrown on the embers. The passage was lighted up with a bright flame. "It is Top!" cried Herbert. It was indeed Top, a magnificent Anglo-Norman, who, derived from these two races, crossed the swiftness of foot and the acuteness of smell which are the preeminent qualities of coursing dogs. It was the dog of the engineer, Cyrus Harding. But he was alone. Neither Neb nor his master accompanied him. How was it that his instinct had guided him straight to the chimneys, which he did not know? It appeared inexplicable, above all, in the midst of this black night and in such a tempest. But what was still more inexplicable was that Top was neither tired nor exhausted, nor even soiled with mud or sand. Herbert had drawn him towards him and was patting his head, the dog rubbing his neck against the lad's hands. "If the dog is found, the master will be found also," said the reporter. "God grant it," responded Herbert. "Let us set off. Top will guide us." Pencroft did not make any objection. He felt that Top's arrival contradicted his conjectures. "Come along, then," said he. Pencroft carefully covered the embers on the hearth. He placed a few pieces of wood among them so as to keep in the fire until their return. Then, preceded by the dog, who seemed to invite them by short barks to come with him, and followed by the reporter and the boy, he dashed out, after having put up in his handkerchief the remains of the supper. The storm was then in all its violence, and perhaps at its height. Not a single ray of light from the moon pierced through the clouds. To follow a straight course was difficult. It was best to rely on Top's instinct. They did so. The reporter and Herbert walked behind the dog, and the sailor brought up the rear. It was impossible to exchange a word. The rain was not very heavy, but the wind was terrific. However, one circumstance favored the seaman and his two companions. The wind, being southeast, consequently blew on their backs. The clouds of sand, which otherwise would have been insupportable, from being received behind, did not in consequence impede their progress. In short, they sometimes went faster than they liked, and had some difficulty in keeping their feet, but hope gave them strength, for it was not at random that they made their way along the shore. They had no doubt that Neb had found his master, and that he had sent them the faithful dog. But was the engineer living, or had Neb only sent for his companions that they might render the last duties to the corpse of the unfortunate Harding? After having passed the precipice, Herbert, the reporter, and Pencroft prudently stepped aside to stop and take breath. The turn of the rocks sheltered them from the wind, and they could breathe after this walk, or rather run of a quarter of an hour. They could now hear and reply to each other, and the lad, having pronounced the name of Cyrus Harding, Top gave a few short barks, as much as to say that his master was saved. "Saved, isn't he?" repeated Herbert. "Saved, Top." And the dog barked in reply. They once more set out. The tide began to rise, and urged by the wind it threatened to be unusually high, as it was a spring tide. Great billows thundered against the reef with such violence that they probably passed entirely over the islet, then quite invisible. The mole no longer protected the coast, which was directly exposed to the attacks of the open sea. As soon as the sailor and his companions left the precipice, the wind struck them again with renewed fury. Though bent under the gale, they walked very quickly, following Top, who did not hesitate as to what direction to take. They ascended towards the north, having on their left an interminable extent of billows, which broke with a deafening noise, and on their right a dark country, the aspect of which it was impossible to guess. But they felt that it was comparatively flat, for the wind passed completely over them, without being driven back as it was when it came in contact with the cliff. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they reckoned that they had cleared about 5 miles. The clouds were slightly raised, and the wind, though less damp, was very sharp and cold. Insufficiently protected by their clothing, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett suffered cruelly, but not a complaint escaped their lips. They were determined to follow Top wherever the intelligent animal wished to lead them. Towards 5 o'clock, day began to break. At the zenith, where the fog was less thick, grey shades bordered the clouds. Under an opaque belt, a luminous line clearly traced the horizon. The crests of the billows were tipped with a wild light, and the foam regained its whiteness. At the same time, on the left, the hilly parts of the coast could be seen, though very indistinctly. At 6 o'clock, day had broken. The clouds rapidly lifted. The seaman and his companions were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys. They were following a very flat shore bounded by a reef of rocks whose heads scarcely emerged from the sea, for they were in deep water. On the left, the country appeared to be one vast extent of sandy downs, bristling with thistles. There was no cliff, and the shore offered no resistance to the ocean, but a chain of irregular hillocks. Here and there grew 2 or 3 trees inclined towards the west, their branches projecting in that direction. Quite behind, in the southwest, extended the border of the forest. At this moment, Top became very excited. He ran forward, then returned, and seemed to entreat them to hasten their steps. The dog then left the beach, and guided by his wonderful instinct, without showing the least hesitation, went straight in among the downs. They followed him. The country appeared an absolute desert. Not a living creature was to be seen. The downs, the extent of which was large, were composed of hillocks and even of hills, very irregularly distributed. They resembled a Switzerland modelled in sand, and only an amazing instinct could have possibly recognized the way. 5 minutes after having left the beach, the reporter and his 2 companions arrived at a sort of excavation hollowed out at the back of a high mound. There Top stopped and gave a loud, clear bark. Spilett, Herbert, and Pencroft dashed into the cave. Neb was there, kneeling beside a body extended on a bed of grass. The body was that of the engineer, Cyrus Harding. Chapter 8. Neb did not move. Pencroft only uttered one word. "Living?" he cried. Neb did not reply. Spilett and the sailor turned pale. Herbert clasped his hands and remained motionless. The poor negro, absorbed in his grief, evidently had neither seen his companions nor heard the sailor speak. The reporter knelt down beside the motionless body and placed his ear to the engineer's chest, having first torn open his clothes. A minute, an age, passed, during which he endeavoured to catch the faintest throb of the heart. Neb had raised himself a little and gazed without seeing. Despair had completely changed his countenance. He could scarcely be recognized, exhausted with fatigue, broken with grief. He believed his master was dead. Gideon Spilett at last rose, after a long and attentive examination. "He lives," said he. Pencroft knelt in his turn beside the engineer. He also heard a throbbing, and even felt a slight breath on his cheek. Herbert, at a word from the reporter, ran out to look for water. He found, 100 feet off, a limpid stream, which seemed to have been greatly increased by the rains, and which filtered through the sand, but nothing in which to put the water, not even a shell among the downs. The lad was obliged to content himself with dipping his handkerchief in the stream, and with it hastened back to the grotto. Happily, the wet handkerchief was enough for Gideon Spilett, who only wished to wet the engineer's lips. The cold water produced an almost immediate effect. His chest heaved, and he seemed to try to speak. "We will save him!" exclaimed the reporter. At these words, hope revived in Neb's heart. He undressed his master to see if he was wounded, but not so much as a bruise was to be found, either on the head, body, or limbs, which was surprising, as he must have been dashed against the rocks. Even the hands were uninjured, and it was difficult to explain how the engineer showed no traces of the efforts which he must have made to get out of reach of the breakers. But the explanation would come later. When Cyrus was able to speak, he would say what had happened. For the present, the question was how to recall him to life, and it appeared likely that rubbing would bring this about, so they set to work with the sailor's jersey. The engineer, revived by this rude shampooing, moved his arms slightly and began to breathe more regularly. He was sinking from exhaustion, and certainly, had not the reporter and his companions arrived, it would have been all over with Cyrus Harding. "You thought your master was dead, didn't you?" said the seaman to Neb. "Yes, quite dead," replied Neb. "And if Top had not found you and brought you here, I should have buried my master, and then have lain down on his grave to die." It had indeed been a narrow escape for Cyrus Harding. Neb then recounted what had happened. The day before, after having left the Chimneys at daybreak, he had ascended the coast in a northerly direction, and had reached that part of the shore which he had already visited. There, without any hope, he acknowledged, Neb had searched the beach, among the rocks, on the sand, for the smallest trace to guide him. He examined particularly that part of the beach which was not covered by the high tide, for near the sea the water would have obliterated all marks. Neb did not expect to find his master living. It was for a corpse that he searched, a corpse which he wished to bury with his own hands. He sought long in vain. This desert coast appeared never to have been visited by a human creature. The shells, those which the sea had not reached, and which might be met with by millions above high water mark, were untouched. Not a shell was broken. Neb then resolved to walk along the beach for some miles. It was possible that the waves had carried the body to quite a distant point. When a corpse floats a little distance from a low shore, it rarely happens that the tide does not throw it up, sooner or later. This Neb knew, and he wished to see his master again for the last time. I went along the coast for another 2 miles, carefully examining the beach, both at high and low water, and I had despaired of finding anything, when yesterday, above 5 in the evening, I saw footprints on the sand. "Footprints?" exclaimed Pencroft. "Yes," replied Neb. "Did these footprints begin at the water's edge?" asked the reporter. "No," replied Neb, "only above high water mark, for the others must have been washed out by the tide." "Go on, Neb," said Spilett. "I went half crazy when I saw these footprints. They were very clear and went towards the downs. I followed them for a quarter of a mile, running, but taking care not to destroy them. 5 minutes after, as it was getting dark, I heard the barking of a dog. It was Top, and Top brought me here, to my master." Neb ended his account by saying what had been his grief at finding the inanimate body, in which he vainly sought for the least sign of life. Now that he had found him dead, he longed for him to be alive. All his efforts were useless. Nothing remained to be done but to render the last duties to the one whom he had loved so much. Neb then thought of his companions. They, no doubt, would wish to see the unfortunate man again. Top was there. Could he not rely on the sagacity of the faithful animal? Neb several times pronounced the name of the reporter, the one among his companions whom Top knew best. Then he pointed to the south, and the dog bounded off in the direction indicated to him. We have heard how, guided by an instinct which might be looked upon almost as supernatural, Top had found them. Neb's companions had listened with great attention to this account. It was unaccountable to them how Cyrus Harding, after the efforts which he must have made to escape from the waves by crossing the rocks, had not received even a scratch. And what could not be explained either was how the engineer had managed to get to this cave in the Downs, more than a mile from the shore. "So, Neb," said the reporter, "it was not you who brought your master to this place?" "No, it was not I," replied the Negro. "It's very clear that the captain came here by himself," said Pencroft. "It is clear in reality," observed Spilett, "but it is not credible." The explanation of this fact could only be produced from the engineer's own lips, and they must wait for that till speech returned. Rubbing had re-established the circulation of the blood. Cyrus Harding moved his arm again, then his head, and a few incomprehensible words escaped him. Neb, who was bending over him, spoke, but the engineer did not appear to hear, and his eyes remained closed. Life was only exhibited in him by movement, his senses had not as yet been restored. Pencroft much regretted not having either fire or the means of procuring it, for he had, unfortunately, forgotten to bring the burnt linen, which would easily have ignited from the sparks produced by striking together two flints. As to the engineer's pockets, they were entirely empty, except that of his waistcoat, which contained his watch. It was necessary to carry Harding to the Chimneys, and that as soon as possible. This was the opinion of all. Meanwhile, the care which was lavished on the engineer brought him back to consciousness sooner than they could have expected. The water with which they wetted his lips revived him gradually. Pencroft also thought of mixing with the water some moisture from the tetra's flesh which he had brought. Herbert ran to the beach and returned with two large bivalve shells. The sailor concocted something which he introduced between the lips of the engineer, who, eagerly drinking it, opened his eyes. Neb and the reporter were leaning over him. "My master! My master!" cried Neb. The engineer heard him. He recognized Neb and Spilett, then his other two companions, and his hand slightly pressed theirs. A few words again escaped him, which showed what thoughts were, even then, troubling his brain. This time he was understood. Undoubtedly they were the same words he had before attempted to utter. "Island or continent?" he murmured. "Bother the continent!" cried Pencroft hastily. "There is time enough to see about that, Captain. We don't care for anything, provided you are living." The engineer nodded faintly, and then appeared to sleep. They respected this sleep, and the reporter began immediately to make arrangements for transporting Harding to a more comfortable place. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroft left the cave and directed their steps towards a high mound crowned with a few distorted trees. On the way, the sailor could not help repeating, "Island or continent? To think of that, when at one's last gasp? What a man!" Arrived at the summit of the mound, Pencroft and his two companions set to work, with no other tools than their hands, to despoil of its principal branches a rather sickly tree, a sort of marine fir. With these branches they made a litter, on which, covered with grass and leaves, they could carry the engineer. This occupied them nearly 40 minutes, and it was 10 o'clock when they returned to Cyrus Harding, whom Spilett had not left. The engineer was just awaking from the sleep, or rather from the drowsiness, in which they had found him. The colour was returning to his cheeks, which till now had been as pale as death. He raised himself a little, looked around him, and appeared to ask where he was. "Can you listen to me without fatigue, Cyrus?" asked the reporter. "Yes," replied the engineer. "It's my opinion," said the sailor, "that Captain Harding will be able to listen to you still better if he will have some more grouse jelly. For we have grouse, Captain," added he, presenting him with a little of this jelly, to which he this time added some of the flesh. Cyrus Harding ate a little of the grouse, and the rest was divided among his companions, who found it but a meagre breakfast, for they were suffering extremely from hunger. "Well," said the sailor, "there is plenty of food at the chimneys, for you must know, Captain, that down there in the south we have a house with rooms, beds, and fireplace, and in the pantry several dozen of birds, which our Herbert calls couroucous. Your litter is ready, and as soon as you feel strong enough, we will carry you home." "Thanks, my friend," replied the engineer. "Wait another hour or two, and then we will set out. And now speak, Spilett." The reporter then told him all that had occurred. He recounted all the events with which Cyrus was unacquainted, the last fall of the balloon, the landing on this unknown land, which appeared a desert, whatever it was, whether island or continent, the discovery of the chimneys, the search for him, not forgetting, of course, Neb's devotion, the intelligence exhibited by the faithful Top, as well as many other matters. "But," asked Harding, in a still feeble voice, "you did not, then, pick me up on the beach?" "No," replied the reporter. "And did you not bring me to this cave?" "No." "At what distance is this cave from the sea?" "About a mile," replied Pencroft. "And if you are astonished, Captain, we are not less surprised ourselves at seeing you in this place." "Indeed," said the engineer, who was recovering gradually, and who took great interest in these details. "Indeed, it is very singular." "But," resumed the sailor, "can you tell us what happened after you were carried off by the sea?" Cyrus Harding considered. He knew very little. The wave had torn him from the balloon net. He sank at first several fathoms. On returning to the surface, in the half-light, he felt a living creature struggling near him. It was Top, who had sprung to his help. He saw nothing of the balloon, which, lightened both of his weight and that of the dog, had darted away like an arrow. There he was, in the midst of the angry sea, at a distance which could not be less than half a mile from the shore. He attempted to struggle against the billows by swimming vigorously. Top held him up by his clothes, but a strong current seized him and drove him towards the north, and after half an hour of exertion he sank, dragging Top with him into the depths. From that moment to the moment in which he recovered to find himself in the arms of his friends, he remembered nothing. "However," remarked Pencroft, "you must have been thrown onto the beach, and you must have had strength to walk here, since Neb found your footmarks." "Yes, of course," replied the engineer thoughtfully. "And you found no traces of human beings on this coast?" "Not a trace," replied the reporter. "Besides, if by chance you had met with some deliverer there, just in the nick of time, why should he have abandoned you after having saved you from the waves?" "You are right, my dear Spilett. Tell me, Neb," added the engineer, turning to his servant, "it was not you who— You can't have had a moment of unconsciousness, during which— No, that's absurd. Do any of the footsteps still remain?" asked Harding. "Yes, master," replied Neb. "Here, at the entrance, at the back of the mound, in a place sheltered from the rain and wind. The storm has destroyed the others." "Pencroft," said Cyrus Harding, "will you take my shoe and see if it fits exactly to the footprints?" The sailor did as the engineer requested. While he and Herbert, guided by Neb, went to the place where the footprints were to be found, Cyrus remarked to the reporter, "It is a most extraordinary thing." "Perfectly inexplicable," replied Gideon Spilett. "But do not dwell upon it just now, my dear Spilett. We will talk about it by and by." A moment after the others entered. There was no doubt about it. The engineer's shoe fitted exactly to the footmarks. It was therefore Cyrus Harding who had left them on the sand. "Come," said he, "I must have experienced this unconsciousness which I attributed to Neb. I must have walked like a somnambulist, without any knowledge of my steps, and Top must have guided me here, after having dragged me from the waves. Come, Top, come, old dog." The magnificent animal bounded barking to his master, and caresses were lavished on him. It was agreed that there was no other way of accounting for the rescue of Cyrus Harding, and that Top deserved all the honor of the affair. Towards 12 o'clock, Pencroft having asked the engineer if they could now remove him, Harding, instead of replying, and by an effort which exhibited the most energetic will, got up. But he was obliged to lean on the sailor, or he would have fallen. "Well done," cried Pencroft. "Bring the captain's litter." The litter was brought. The transverse branches had been covered with leaves and long grass. Harding was laid on it, and Pencroft, having taken his place at one end, and Neb at the other, they started towards the coast. There was a distance of 8 miles to be accomplished, but, as they could not go fast, and it would perhaps be necessary to stop frequently, they reckoned that it would take at least 6 hours to reach the Chimneys. The wind was still strong, but fortunately it did not rain. Although lying down, the engineer, leaning on his elbow, observed the coast, particularly inland. He did not speak, but he gazed, and no doubt the appearance of the country, with its inequalities of ground, its forests, its various productions, were impressed on his mind. However, after travelling for 2 hours, fatigue overcame him, and he slept. At 5:30 the little band arrived at the precipice, and a short time after at the Chimneys. They stopped, and the litter was placed on the sand. Cyrus Harding was sleeping profoundly and did not awake. Pencroft, to his extreme surprise, found that the terrible storm had quite altered the aspect of the place. Important changes had occurred. Great blocks of stone lay on the beach, which was also covered with a thick carpet of seaweed, algae, and wrack. Evidently the sea, passing over the islet, had been carried right up to the foot of the enormous curtain of granite. The soil in front of the cave had been torn away by the violence of the waves. A horrid presentiment flashed across Pencroft's mind. He rushed into the passage, but returned almost immediately, and stood motionless, staring at his companions. The fire was out. The drowned cinders were nothing but mud. The burnt linen, which was to have served as tinder, had disappeared. The sea had penetrated to the end of the passages, and everything was overthrown and destroyed in the interior of the Chimneys. Chapter 9. In a few words, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, and Neb were made acquainted with what had happened. This accident, which appeared so very serious to Pencroft, produced different effects on the companions of the honest sailor. Neb, in his delight at having found his master, did not listen, or rather, did not care to trouble himself with what Pencroft was saying. Herbert shared in some degree the sailor's feelings. As to the reporter, he simply replied, "Upon my word, Pencroft, it's perfectly indifferent to me. But I repeat that we haven't any fire." "Pooh!" "Nor any means of relighting it." "Nonsense." "But I say, Mr. Spilett—" "Isn't Cyrus here?" replied the reporter. "Is not our engineer alive? He will soon find some way of making fire for us." "With what?" "With nothing." What had Pencroft to say? He could say nothing, for in the bottom of his heart he shared the confidence which his companions had in Cyrus Harding. The engineer was to them a microcosm, a compound of every science, a possessor of all human knowledge. It was better to be with Cyrus in a desert island than without him in the most flourishing town in the United States. With him they could want nothing. With him they would never despair. If these brave men had been told that a volcanic eruption would destroy the land, that this land would be engulfed in the depths of the Pacific, they would have imperturbably replied, "Cyrus is here." While in the palanquin, however, the engineer had again relapsed into unconsciousness, which the jolting to which he had been subjected during his journey had brought on, so that they could not now appeal to his ingenuity. The supper must necessarily be very meagre. In fact, all the grouse flesh had been consumed, and there no longer existed any means of cooking more game. Besides, the carucas which had been reserved had disappeared. They must consider what was to be done. First of all, Cyrus Harding was carried into the central passage. There they managed to arrange for him a couch of seaweed, which still remained almost dry. The deep sleep which had overpowered him would no doubt be more beneficial to him than any nourishment. Night had closed in, and the temperature, which had modified when the wind shifted to the northwest, again became extremely cold. Also, the sea having destroyed the partitions which Pencroft had put up in certain places in the passages, the Chimneys, on account of the draughts, had become scarcely habitable. The engineer's condition would, therefore, have been bad enough if his companions had not carefully covered him with their coats and waistcoats. Supper, this evening, was of course composed of the inevitable lithodomes, of which Herbert and Neb picked up a plentiful supply on the beach. However, to these mollusks the lad added some edible seaweed, which he gathered on high rocks, whose sides were only washed by the sea at the time of high tides. This seaweed, which belongs to the order of Fucacae of the genus Sargassum, produces, when dry, a gelatinous matter, rich and nutritious. The reporter and his companions, after having eaten a quantity of lithodomes, sucked the sargassum, of which the taste was very tolerable. It is used in parts of the East very considerably by the natives. "Never mind," said the sailor. "The captain will help us soon." Meanwhile, the cold became very severe, and unhappily they had no means of defending themselves from it. The sailor, extremely vexed, tried in all sorts of ways to procure fire. Neb helped him in this work. He found some dry moss, and by striking together 2 pebbles he obtained some sparks, but the moss, not being inflammable enough, did not take fire, for the sparks were really only incandescent, and not at all of the same consistency as those which are emitted from flint when struck in the same manner. The experiment, therefore, did not succeed. Pencroft, although he had no confidence in the proceeding, then tried rubbing 2 pieces of dry wood together, as savages do. Certainly, the movement which he and Neb exhibited, if it had been transformed into heat, according to the new theory, would have been enough to heat the boiler of a steamer. It came to nothing. The bits of wood became hot, to be sure, but much less so than the operators themselves. After working an hour, Pencroft, who was in a complete state of perspiration, threw down the pieces of wood in disgust. "I can never be made to believe that savages light their fires in this way. Let them say what they will," he exclaimed. "I could sooner light my arms by rubbing them against each other." The sailor was wrong to despise the proceeding. Savages often kindle wood by means of rapid rubbing, but every sort of wood does not answer for the purpose, and besides, there is the knack, following the usual expression, and it is probable that Pencroft had not the knack. Pencroft's ill humour did not last long. Herbert had taken the bits of wood which he had turned down and was exerting himself to rub them. The hardy sailor could not restrain a burst of laughter on seeing the efforts of the lad to succeed where he had failed. "Rub, my boy, rub," said he. "I am rubbing," replied Herbert, laughing, "but I don't pretend to do anything else but warm myself instead of shivering, and soon I shall be as hot as you are, my good Pencroft." This soon happened. However, they were obliged to give up, for this night at least, the attempt to procure fire. Gideon Spilett repeated, for the 20th time, that Cyrus Harding would not have been troubled for so small a difficulty, and in the meantime he stretched himself in one of the passages on his bed of sand. Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft did the same, while Top slept at his master's feet. Next day, the 28th of March, when the engineer awoke about 8 in the morning, he saw his companions around him watching his sleep, and, as on the day before, his first words were, "Island or continent?" This was his uppermost thought. "Well," replied Pencroft, "we don't know anything about it, Captain." "You don't know yet?" "But we shall know," rejoined Pencroft, "when you have guided us into the country." "I think I am able to try it," replied the engineer, who, without much effort, rose and stood upright. "That's capital!" cried the sailor. "I feel dreadfully weak," replied Harding. "Give me something to eat, my friends, and it will soon go off. You have fire, haven't you?" This question was not immediately replied to, but in a few seconds. "Alas, we have no fire," said Pencroft. "Or rather, Captain, we have it no longer." And the sailor recounted all that had passed the day before. He amused the engineer by the history of the single match, then his abortive attempt to procure fire in the savage's way. "We shall consider," replied the engineer, "and if we do not find some substance similar to tinder—" "Well?" asked the sailor. "Well, we will make matches." "Chemicals?" "Chemicals. It is not more difficult than that," cried the reporter, striking the sailor on the shoulder. The latter did not think it so simple, but he did not protest. All went out. The weather had become very fine. The sun was rising from the sea's horizon and touched with golden spangles the prismatic rugosities of the huge precipice. Having thrown a rapid glance around him, the engineer seated himself on a block of stone. Herbert offered him a few handfuls of shellfish and sargassum, saying, "It is all that we have, Captain Harding." "Thanks, my boy," replied Harding. "It will do, for this morning at least." He ate the wretched food with appetite and washed it down with a little fresh water drawn from the river in an immense shell. His companions looked at him without speaking. Then, feeling somewhat refreshed, Cyrus Harding crossed his arms and said, "So, my friends, you do not know yet whether fate has thrown us on an island or on a continent?" "No, Captain," replied the boy. "We shall know tomorrow," said the engineer. "Till then, there is nothing to be done." "Yes," replied Pencroft. "What?" "Fire," said the sailor, who also had a fixed idea. "We will make it, Pencroft," replied Harding. "While you were carrying me yesterday, did I not see in the west a mountain which commands the country?" "Yes," replied Spilett, "a mountain which must be rather high." "Well," replied the engineer, "we will climb to the summit tomorrow, and then we shall see if this land is an island or a continent. Till then, I repeat, there is nothing to be done." "Yes, fire," said the obstinate sailor again. "But he will make us a fire," replied Gideon Spilett. "Only have a little patience, Pencroft." The seaman looked at Spilett in a way which seemed to say, "If it depended upon you to do it, we wouldn't taste roast meat very soon." But he was silent. Meanwhile, Captain Harding had made no reply. He appeared to be very little troubled by the question of fire. For a few minutes he remained absorbed in thought, then again speaking. "My friends," said he, "our situation is, perhaps, deplorable, but, at any rate, it is very plain. Either we are on a continent, and then, at the expense of greater or less fatigue, we shall reach some inhabited place, or we are on an island. In the latter case, if the island is inhabited, we will try to get out of the scrape with the help of its inhabitants. If it is desert, we will try to get out of the scrape by ourselves." "Certainly. Nothing could be plainer," replied Pencroft. "But whether it is an island or a continent," asked Gideon Spilett, "whereabouts do you think, Cyrus, this storm has thrown us?" "I cannot say exactly," replied the engineer, "but I presume it is some land in the Pacific. In fact, when we left Richmond, the wind was blowing from the northeast, and its very violence greatly proves that it could not have varied. If the direction has been maintained from the northeast to the southwest, we have traversed the states of North Carolina, of South Carolina, of Georgia, the Gulf of Mexico, Mexico itself in its narrow part, then a part of the Pacific Ocean. I cannot estimate the distance traversed by the balloon at less than 6,000 to 7,000 miles, and, even supposing that the wind had varied half a quarter, it must have brought us either to the archipelago of Mendava, either on the Pomotus, or even, if it had a greater strength than I suppose, to the land of New Zealand. If the last hypothesis is correct, it will be easy enough to get home again. English or Maoris, we shall always find someone to whom we can speak. If, on the contrary, this is the coast of a desert island in some tiny archipelago, perhaps we shall be able to reconnoiter it from the summit of that peak, which overlooks the country, and then we shall see how best to establish ourselves here as if we are never to go away." "Never?" cried the reporter. "You say never, my dear Cyrus?" "Better to put things at the worst at first," replied the engineer, "and reserve the best for a surprise." "Well said," remarked Pencroft. "It is to be hoped, too, that this island, if it be one, is not situated just out of the course of ships. That would be really unlucky." "We shall not know what we have to rely on until we have first made the ascent of the mountain," replied the engineer. "But tomorrow, Captain," asked Herbert, "shall you be in a state to bear the fatigue of the ascent?" "I hope so," replied the engineer, "provided you and Pencroft, my boy, show yourselves quick and clever hunters." "Captain," said the sailor, "since you are speaking of game, if on my return I was as certain of roasting it as I am of bringing it back." "Bring it back all the same, Pencroft," replied Harding. It was then agreed that the engineer and the reporter were to pass the day at the Chimneys so as to examine the shore and the upper plateau. Neb, Herbert, and the sailor were to return to the forest, renew their store of wood, and lay violent hands on every creature, feathered or hairy, which might come within their reach. They set out accordingly about 10 o'clock in the morning, Herbert confident, Neb joyous, Pencroft murmuring aside, "If, on my return, I find a fire at the house, I shall believe that the thunder itself came to light it." All three climbed the bank, and arrived at the angle made by the river. The sailor, stopping, said to his two companions, "Shall we begin by being hunters or woodmen?" "Hunters," replied Herbert. "There is Top already in quest." "We will hunt, then," said the sailor, "and afterwards we can come back and collect our wood." This agreed to, Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft, after having torn 3 sticks from the trunk of a young fir, followed Top, who was bounding about among the long grass. This time the hunters, instead of following the course of the river, plunged straight into the heart of the forest. There were still the same trees, belonging, for the most part, to the pine family. In certain places, less crowded, growing in clumps, these pines exhibited considerable dimensions, and appeared to indicate by their development that the country was situated in a higher latitude than the engineer had supposed. Glades, bristling with stumps worn away by time, were covered with dry wood, which formed an inexhaustible store of fuel. Then, the glade passed, the underwood thickened again, and became almost impenetrable. It was difficult enough to find the way among the groups of trees without any beaten track, so the sailor from time to time broke off branches which might be easily recognized. But perhaps he was wrong not to follow the watercourse, as he and Herbert had done on their first excursion, for after walking an hour not a creature had shown itself. Top, running under the branches, only roused birds which could not be approached. Even the couroucous were invisible, and it was probable that the sailor would be obliged to return to the marshy part of the forest in which he had so happily performed his grouse fishing. "Well, Pencroft," said Neb, in a slightly sarcastic tone, "if this is all the game which you promised to bring back to my master, it won't need a large fire to roast it." "Have patience," replied the sailor. "It isn't the game which will be wanting on our return." "Have you not confidence in Captain Harding?" "Yes." "But you don't believe that he will make fire?" "I shall believe it when the wood is blazing in the fireplace." "It will blaze, since my master has said so." "We shall see." Meanwhile, the sun had not reached the highest point in its course above the horizon. The exploration, therefore, continued, and was usefully marked by a discovery which Herbert made of a tree whose fruit was edible. This was the stone pine, which produces an excellent almond, very much esteemed in the temperate regions of America and Europe. These almonds were in a perfect state of maturity, and Herbert described them to his companions, who feasted on them. "Come," said Pencroft, "seaweed by way of bread, raw mussels for meat, and almonds for dessert. That's certainly a good dinner for those who have not a single match in their pocket." "We mustn't complain," said Herbert. "I am not complaining, my boy," replied Pencroft. "Only I repeat that meat is a little too much economized in this sort of meal." "Top has found something," cried Neb, who ran towards a thicket, in the midst of which the dog had disappeared, barking. With Top's barking were mingled curious gruntings. The sailor and Herbert had followed Neb. If there was game there, this was not the time to discuss how it was to be cooked, but rather how they were to get hold of it. The hunters had scarcely entered the bushes when they saw Top engaged in a struggle with an animal which he was holding by the ear. This quadruped was a sort of pig, nearly 2 feet and a half long, of a blackish-brown colour, lighter below, having hard, scanty hair. Its toes, then strongly fixed in the ground, seemed to be united by a membrane. Herbert recognized in this animal the capybara, that is to say, one of the largest members of the rodent order. Meanwhile, the capybara did not struggle against the dog. It stupidly rolled its eyes, deeply buried in a thick bed of fat. Perhaps it saw men for the first time. However, Neb, having tightened his grasp on his stick, was just going to fell the pig when the latter, tearing itself from Top's teeth, by which it was only held by the tip of its ear, uttered a vigorous grunt, rushed upon Herbert, almost overthrew him, and disappeared in the wood. "The rascal!" cried Pencroft. All three directly darted after Top, but at the moment when they joined him, the animal had disappeared under the waters of a large pond shaded by venerable pines. Neb, Herbert, and Pencroft stopped, motionless. Top plunged into the water, but the capybara, hidden at the bottom of the pond, did not appear. "Let us wait," said the boy, "for he will soon come to the surface to breathe." "Won't he drown?" asked Neb. "No," replied Herbert, "since he has webbed feet and is almost an amphibious animal. But watch him." Top remained in the water. Pencroft and his two companions went to different parts of the bank so as to cut off the retreat of the capybara, which the dog was looking for beneath the water. Herbert was not mistaken. In a few minutes the animal appeared on the surface of the water. Top was upon it in a bound and kept it from plunging again. An instant later, the capybara, dragged to the bank, was killed by a blow from Neb's stick. "Hurrah!" cried Pencroft, who was always ready with this cry of triumph. "Give me but a good fire, and this pig shall be gnawed to the bones." Pencroft hoisted the capybara on his shoulders, and judging by the height of the sun that it was about 2 o'clock, he gave the signal to return. Top's instinct was useful to the hunters, who, thanks to the intelligent animal, were enabled to discover the road by which they had come. Half an hour later they arrived at the river. Pencroft soon made a raft of wood, as he had done before, though if there was no fire it would be a useless task, and the raft following the current, they returned towards the chimneys. But the sailor had not gone 50 paces when he stopped, and again uttering a tremendous hurrah, pointed towards the angle of the cliff. "Herbert! Neb! Look!" he shouted. Smoke was escaping and curling up among the rocks.